September 2nd, 1796, the Boston-based brig Sally accidentally grounded on a remote shoal in the Pacific Ocean. The Sally's captain, John Pierpont, recounted the events a year later, including that shoal's location, and that seems to have been the first Western discovery of that particular tiny Pacific atoll. Later, one of the two islands of the atoll was named Johnston Island, after the name of a British sea captain who also recorded the location of the islands, although the local name for the island was Iwi-Po'omakapuni. This atoll was remote. The islands were tiny. They had no human population and didn't even have a fresh water source. It was an unlikely place to develop a rich history that deserves to be remembered. The atoll was created some 70 million years ago as underwater volcanic eruptions built up layers of basalt. Geologically, the islands anchor the northern end of the Line Islands Ridge. Over time, the island eroded beneath the surface, but corals around its fringes grew and eventually created a limestone cap thousands of feet thick on top of the ancient volcano. The area is a shallow coral platform of some 50 square miles. The first commercial exploitation of Johnston Island was for its bird poo used for fertilizer, one of more than 100 islands claimed under the 1856 U.S. Guano Islands Act. The Kingdom of Hawaii also claimed the island, naming it Kalana. King Kamehameha IV declared the island to be part of his kingdom in July 1856. However, the Kingdom of Hawaii never tried to economically exploit the island, even as the bird poo was being mined away, and the dispute became irrelevant after Hawaii was annexed to the United States in 1898. The island was mapped and surveyed as part of the wide-ranging Tanager expedition in 1923, named after the Navy ship USS Tanager, which did a thorough biological survey. Partly as a result of the survey, in 1926, President Calvin Coolidge declared Johnston Island and tiny sand island next to it a bird refuge, the Johnston Island Reservation, for the protection of native birds. The purpose of the protection was largely to combat poachers who killed native birds for their feathers, used in the fashion and millinery trade. But at the time, the Department of Agriculture, which had responsibility for the refuge, had no ships that could be used to visit the remote atoll. In 1934, President Franklin Roosevelt moved administration of the island to the Navy, subject, however, to the use of said Johnston and Sand Islands by the Department of Agriculture as a refuge and breeding ground for native birds. The change in administration was partly because, unlike the Department of Agriculture, the Navy actually had ships that could visit Johnston Island, but it was also because the Navy had developed an interest in the atoll for strategic purposes. The Navy began using the islands quickly, and in 1935 began construction of a seaplane base on Sand Island. The base required some coral blasting to clear the seaplane approach, and materials from coral blasting and dredging would be used to progressively expand the island. Eventually, Sand Island was extended into a seaplane base that could support a patrol squadron. The atoll had never had a human population before, but now suddenly tiny Sand Island had facilities for 400 people, including a mess hall, a hospital, water tanks, a radio station, and a control tower. The Navy also built a small parking area southwest of the island, connected the two via a causeway, the first of many changes that the military would make to the island's geography. Marine Jim Devine described the changes to Sand Island in 1944. Sand Island at the time consisted of two islands connected by a single-lane coral roadway about 600 feet long. The northeast island was natural, about 5 acres. The southwest island was completely dredged up from the sea and was about the size of a baseball diamond. It was about 18 inches out of high tide, and you could stand in the middle, throw a piece of coral, and hit the water. But the Navy had bigger plans for the larger nearby Johnston Island. In February 1941, with tensions in the Pacific high, President Roosevelt issued another executive order regarding Johnston Atoll, establishing both a Naval Defense Sea Area and a Naval Airspace Reservation. Only U.S. government ships and aircraft were allowed within the areas. Construction of a 4,000-foot by 500-foot runway and a base on Johnston Island began in September and was completed before December 7th. A ship channel was dredged, with the material used to expand the island's area. The base was attacked by fire from Japanese submarines twice in December 1941, but was too close to Hawaii for the Japanese to consider an amphibious assault. Quickly, the war shifted west in the Pacific. As Devine put it, the war was about 1,500 miles west of us. That made for an interesting wartime experience. Devine described the horrors of war. The most horrific instances occurred when for one whole week we had no chocolate ice cream, only vanilla and strawberry because the ice cream machine broke down. Then the movie machine broke for a week, and a shark even got into our swimming area. While the Japanese caused no casualties on the atoll, there were a few deaths there, including 6 Seabees who died from bad moonshine they'd cooked up. In March of 1943, a consolidated Catalina PBY seaplane crashed on approach, killing all 10 crew members on board. But being far from the front does not mean that the island was not active. By 1944, Johnston Atoll was one of the busiest airport transport terminals in the Pacific, and the runway was extended to 6,000 feet and later to 9,000 feet. During the war, the island was used as an airfield, a base for anti-submarine patrols, a reconnaissance plane base, a communications station, and a ship and submarine refueling station. One of the island's anti-aircraft batteries had been destined for Wake Island before the island fell to the Japanese on December 23, 1941. By 1947, over 1,300 B-29 and B-24 bombers had passed through Johnston Island, being returned to the U.S. after the war. In 1948, administration of the island passed to the United States Air Force, and Johnston Island Air Force Base served the needs of both the Air Force and the Military Air Transportation Service. The importance of the island as a transportation hub increased again during the Korean War, and it was also used as a refueling stop for airplanes during the Vietnam War. Despite being well outside the line of fire for most of the war, Johnston's World War II experience was significant. Being developed into a base, with an airfield large enough to land the Air Force's biggest bombers, paths cleared through the coral to allow access to ships, and establish military-protected air and sea space would have a significant impact on the island's history. In the post-war world, a base with such facilities in such a remote location was of value to the United States. As Grace Plummer and Barbara Johnson, former Department of Energy employees on the island, described it, Little Johnston Atoll boasts a huge launch window, a wonderfully effective sea-cleaning lagoon, and is far away from inhabited spaces. Mike Kirby, who worked on the island in the 1970s, put it more bluntly. With no reporters allowed, the armed forces were free to run almost any kind of program on Johnston Island, with minimum oversight. Among those uses was as a navigational station. In 1958, a LORAN, or Long Range Navigational Station, operated by the U.S. Coast Guard, began operating. LORAN-A was a type of hyperbolic radio navigation in which a navigation receiver instrument on a ship or aircraft is used to determine location based on the difference in timing of radio waves received from fixed land-based radio navigation beacon transmitters. Establishing the transmitter at Johnston allowed better accuracy in determining the position of ships along an important transportation route. The Coast Guard operated a LORAN station on the atoll for 34 years, finally ending operation in July of 1992, by which time the advent of satellite navigation had reduced the need for the station. But Johnston also played a role in the nuclear arms race of the Cold War. Not only was the airfield an important transportation point between Hawaii and islands engaged in testing, but a handful of nuclear tests were conducted from the island. In 1958, the size of the island was expanded again using coral dredging and a launch facility established on the new ground. Operation Hardtack-1 was a series of nuclear tests in 1958 that included more nuclear detonations than the total of all prior nuclear explosions in the Pacific Ocean. Two of those, high-altitude tests codenamed Teak and Orange, were approximately 3.8 megaton detonations from missiles launched from the Johnston Island Launch Facility in August 1958. This photo shows the brightness of the hardtack Teak explosion on August 1st, nearly 48 miles above the base. It was, however, tests during Operation Dominic in 1962 that would have a larger impact on the island's future. 9 missiles, 8 Thor intermediate-range missiles and 1 Nike Hercules missile were launched from Johnston Island between May and November 1962. Fully 4 of those launches failed at different points, and 3 of those failures resulted in significant radiological contamination on the island. Most notably, the launch codenamed Bluegill Prime on July 25th occurred on the launch pad and resulted in explosions and fire that engulfed the missile and nuclear warhead. A 2016 report by the Air Force Safety Center Weapons Safety Division explained, extensive radioactive contamination to the launch pad occurred as a result of this launch failure. The Johnston Island Launch Complex was heavily damaged and contaminated with plutonium. Launches had to be halted until the radioactive debris could be dumped and the launch pad rebuilt. Troops were sent in to do a rapid cleanup, but repairs still took 3 months. In 2016, the Air Force noted, the radiological impacts of the Bluegill Prime launch failure invoked significant cleanup activities during Dominic 1 and for nearly 4 decades after the failures. Much of the contaminated area was covered up when the island was expanded through dredging a final time between 1962 and 1963, expanding the island, which initially encompassed 46 acres, to 596 acres, or about 1.06 square miles. The Dominic 1 launches from Johnston Island also included the July 8 Starfish Prime launch. The 1.4 megaton nuclear explosion at an altitude of some 250 miles created an electromagnetic pulse that was far larger than expected. so much so that it was difficult to measure as it threw the instruments off scale. The pulse was so significant that, according to the Associated Press, it knocked out power to traffic lights and telecommunications in parts of Honolulu, some 898 miles away, illuminating the sky and even leading hotels to host viewing parties. The results of the high-altitude test of Operation Dominic gave rise then to one of the more interesting parts of Johnston Island's history. Johnston Island was the base for the super-secret Operation 437. The operation had Johnston locating 2 Thor missiles at its launch facility as an anti-satellite weapons program. The PGM Thor ballistic missiles would carry W-50 nuclear warheads and were intended to explode in the high atmosphere and destroy enemy satellites with an electromagnetic pulse. Further facilities were built, and there were several test launches of modified Thor missiles, although without nuclear payloads. The program was inactivated in 1970, partly because the Air Force was afraid the pulse could destroy our own satellites as well. Johnston also housed part of the U.S. satellite tracking program, housing a Baker-Nunn camera satellite tracking station from 1965 to 1977. The camera used 50mm wide film derived from the CinemaScope 55 motion picture process and 20-inch aperture, allowing it to follow satellites in the sky. Already a part of several Cold War programs, Johnston was also used for the recovery of data from CIA reconnaissance satellites. The low Earth orbit satellites would drop capsules with film canisters. The capsules would be captured in midair by JC-130 aircraft based at Johnston Island and operated by the U.S. National Reconnaissance Office. And if nuclear testing and spy operations weren't enough, Johnston was also a part of the U.S. biological weapons program. Johnston was one of the locations used for Project SHAD, Shipborne Hazard and Defense, intended to test U.S. warships' vulnerabilities from chemical and biological attacks. The test had specifically designed Navy warships and aircraft releasing a biological agent in the air to test in the sea environment on U.S. warships. Johnston Island was used for communication and agent preparation for one of the tests. The test used Bacillus goebiji, or Agent BG, on Navy ships, with many of the test subjects unaware that they were being tested. Agent BG was intended to stimulate a biological attack, but was thought at the time to have few health consequences. While the test helped to develop detection and decontamination procedures, Agent BG turned out to have much more significant health consequences than the Navy had anticipated. Details of the secret program didn't start to be released until 2002. In 1970, Johnston's remote location resulted in yet another use: chemical weapon storage. A high-security facility was built and stored tons of chemical weapons from throughout the world in both world wars, much of which had been previously stored at a U.S. base in Okinawa, Japan. Munitions included rockets, mines, and artillery projectiles, as well as containers of dangerous agents such as sarin, mustard gas, and the deadly nerve gas, VX. At its height, the island stored 6.6% of the U.S. chemical weapons stockpile. After 1972, 1.8 million gallons of herbicide orange, a defoliant used in the Vietnam War, which has been connected to significant health problems, was stored on the island in leaking barrels that contaminated both the storage area and the lagoon. Mike Kirby was an explosive ordnance demolition specialist that helped to move the infamous Agent Orange to the island. He said of Johnston at the time, "Not much on the island at the time. I was surprised to find there were 5 bars and numerous dogs running around." The herbicide orange was destroyed by incineration aboard a German incinerator ship, MV Vulcanus, in 1977. And in the final phase of the U.S. military operation on Johnston Atoll, between 1985 and 1986, the U.S. Army created its first chemical weapons disposal facility, the Johnston Atoll Chemical Agent Disposal System, or JCADS. In 1985, Congress mandated the demilitarization and destruction of all chemical agents on Johnston Atoll. And the new facility used mechanical procedures to demilitarize the weapons and incinerate the chemical and explosive agents. JCADS was the test facility for other Army projects to dispose of the U.S. chemical weapons stockpile. The destruction of the weapons on the island was completed in 2000, and the JCADS facility was demolished in 2003. In its 14 years of operation, JCADS destroyed more than 400,000 munitions and 4 million pounds of nerve and blister agents. In August of 2009, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency approved the final closure of the facility. Conrad F. Wine, director of the U.S. Army Chemical Material Agency, said at the time, "The men and women of the JCADS team and our EPA partners have made the chemical weapons of Johnston Atoll history. They have made the world a safer place." In 2005, Johnston Island was briefly put up for auction by the U.S. General Services Administration, billed as a potential residence or vacation getaway, but the ad was removed. Johnston Atoll has now been left to the birds and the occasional monk seal. The base has been closed, the buildings demolished, and the airfield decommissioned and no longer maintained. The atoll is a national wildlife refuge and officially closed to the public, although occasionally visited by vessels crossing the Pacific. Since 2010, the Fish and Wildlife Service have been working to eradicate an infestation of yellow crazy ants on the island. The little atoll was a centerpiece of some of the darkest projects of the Cold War, and yet now it's a wildlife refuge. Still, its history represents an era, not just in U.S. history and world history, but in the lives of the people who work there, as Grace Plummer and Barbara Johnson concluded. The little atoll that everyone and no one wanted housed thousands of civilian and military personnel in its time as a flash in the pan of national security. But it was a great flash, and many memories burn brightly. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.